They say some wars begin with a shot, but in this war there was no declaration, no battlefield, only a single pig rooting through a stranger's garden. And when the trigger was pulled, the echo did not fade. It spread across oceans, across empires, until two of the world's greatest powers stood on the edge of war over a dead pig. Tonight, we drift back to the fog-bound shores of San Juan Island, to a moment when a forgotten animal, a border drawn in error, and the pride of nations, nearly changed the map forever. This is the true story of the pig that nearly started a war. Before we begin, what time is it where you are, and where in the world are you listening from? If you're enjoying these quiet journeys through forgotten history, we'd love to have you subscribe to The Sleepy Planet. Every week, we bring you slow, cinematic retellings of dark and bizarre true stories, from eerie legends to overlooked chapters of history, always told softly and calmly. Now dim the lights, and let's begin tonight's story. It began with no banners, no speeches, no warning. There were no trumpets sounding the onset of a great conflict, nor proclamations from kings or presidents. There was only a clearing on a quiet island, the glint of an overcast morning, and a pig rooting in the wrong garden. San Juan Island lay nestled in the chill waters of the Pacific Northwest, between the American territory of Washington and the British Crown colony of Vancouver Island. Fog rolled in often and lingered. Pines loomed over rocky cliffs. Deer picked through the underbrush in silence. And in the year 1859, this was one of the last places on Earth anyone expected to be the cause of an international crisis. Yet it was here, amid salt-thick air and a quiet dispute over borders, that a single pig met its end and nearly took two empires with it. The pig belonged to the Hudson's Bay Company, the commercial arm of the British Empire in the Pacific Northwest. The animal, large and black with a glistening coat and a stubborn temperament, had wandered freely for months. He was known to root through the vegetable gardens of settlers who lived nearby, most of whom were American homesteaders staking claims under the Oregon Treaty's vague guarantees. One such settler was Lyman Cutler, a man who had come to San Juan seeking land and quiet. He was a farmer by instinct, suspicious of governments and deeply attached to the few rows of potatoes he had managed to coax from the rocky island soil. He had complained about the pig before. Others had warned him not to act rashly. But on a gray morning in early June, when the pig once again trotted into his garden and began nosing through the dirt, Cutler had had enough. He retrieved his rifle, took aim, and pulled the trigger. The pig collapsed in the dirt. It twitched once and was still. Later, Cutler claimed he had not intended to cause trouble. He went to the British authorities and offered compensation. $10, a sum he thought more than fair for the loss. But the pig's owner, Charles Griffin, a staunch British subject with deep ties to the Hudson's Bay Company, refused. He was insulted. He demanded $100 and called for Cutler to be arrested for the destruction of British property. Cutler, in turn, claimed he had shot the pig in defense of his livelihood. He refused arrest and sent word to the American mainland. His message was clear. British forces were threatening an American citizen on American soil. San Juan Island was, at the time, one of the many gray zones left in the wake of rushed diplomacy. The Oregon Treaty of 1846, signed by the United States and Great Britain, had drawn a dividing line along the 49th parallel, but had failed to clarify the fate of the dozens of islands that dotted the Salish Sea. Among them, San Juan was the most contested. Both nations claimed it, both had citizens living on it, and both were watching the other with growing suspicion. The pig's death was, in truth, not the beginning of the trouble. It was the spark in a dry season, a pretext, a symbol of everything unsettled between the British and Americans in the region. Back on the mainland, American military commanders were quick to respond. Brigadier General William S. Harney, known for his combative spirit and staunch patriotism, dispatched Captain George Pickett and a detachment of U.S. soldiers to protect American interests on San Juan Island. Pickett, who would later achieve fame for leading a doomed charge at Gettysburg, arrived with his men in July. They erected a camp on the southern end of the island, near American settlers, and raised the stars and stripes. The British, taken aback by what they saw as an illegal military incursion onto their territory, responded by sending 3 warships into the harbor. Cannons were primed. Orders were drafted. The air over the island shifted from uneasy peace to cold anticipation. Still, no shots were fired. Not yet. For weeks, the soldiers and sailors stared each other down across a landscape of pine and mist. The British ships floated in the harbor, massive and brooding, while American soldiers dug trenches into the earth. It was a strange kind of war, a war of waiting. Islanders watched nervously. The population, no more than a few dozen settlers and company men, knew how quickly things could change. One gunshot, one overstep, one miscommunication, and what began as a quarrel over livestock could become a blood-soaked conflict in a remote corner of the empire. Yet amid the tension, an odd stillness settled over the island. Officers from both sides began to meet. They shared food. They discussed the situation. Some even joked in bitter tones that it would be the most polite war in history. American soldiers fished off the docks. British sailors drank tea on deck. There was no war, but there was no peace either. Back in Washington, both the American and British governments were caught off guard. Neither wanted a full-scale conflict over a matter so trivial, yet neither was willing to back down and appear weak in the face of foreign pressure. Diplomats wrote letters, politicians gave speeches, but on the island, the pig remained the only casualty. And so the weeks turned into months, and the months began to feel like years. The weather shifted, fog crept lower over the hills. The trees stood silent, as if listening. It was a standoff made of nerves and pride, a strange performance of power in a quiet land. And all the while, the people of San Juan waited. They waited for orders. They waited for ships. They waited for reason to return to their nations. In the end, it would not be a general nor a president who would bring resolution, but a foreign emperor called upon to draw a line where none had yet been drawn. But that was still far off. For now, there was only the shot, the sound of a single bullet cracking across an empty garden, the sound that echoed, not through valleys or halls of power, but through history. A pig had died, and the world held its breath. The islands were quiet long before the flags arrived, long before muskets or maps or treaties, long before the English tongue or the American axe. The San Juan Islands belonged only to the wind and the water. Forests, thick with fir and cedar, sloped gently toward sea-blasted cliffs. Orcas surfaced in the distance with soft breath. Sea lions barked from crags. And in the stillness, the rhythms of older lives moved with quiet constancy. The Coast Salish peoples, especially the Lummi and Songhees, had long navigated these waters in carved cedar canoes. To them, The islands were not obstacles or borders. They were lifelines, places to fish, to harvest camas roots, to hunt, to pass through with purpose. Land was not a possession, but a story. A set of relationships carried by the seasons and shared with respect. But that way of knowing was invisible to those who came next. The first Europeans to enter these straits did so under Spanish and British flags. In the late 18th century, as maps filled with blanks and curiosity swelled into conquest, the Pacific Northwest became a canvas for imperial ambition. Spanish ships were the first to chart the outer coastline, but it was the British, under Captain George Vancouver in 1792, who gave names to many of the islands and inlets still used today. San Juan Island received its name not from an American or a Brit, but from a Spaniard, Francisco de Eliza, who charted the region in 1791 and named the archipelago Islas de San Juan in honor of his patron. The British adopted the name but claimed the territory, planting the Union Jack in soil not fully understood. The Americans arrived soon after, not as a navy, but as a tide. By the mid-19th century, the young United States was stretching westward with a kind of restless hunger. The doctrine of manifest destiny proclaimed it a divine mission to expand from Atlantic to Pacific. And with that belief came settlers, surveyors, and soldiers. By the 1840s, the Oregon Trail had become a highway of wooden wheels and weary hope. Thousands crossed the plains, braved the mountains, and reached the fog-wrapped forests of what would become the Oregon Territory. But even then, ownership was unclear. Britain and America had agreed, awkwardly, to joint occupancy of the region, a diplomatic phrase that in practice meant confusion. For years, the two nations lived side by side in the Pacific Northwest, British fur traders operating from Grand Hudson's Bay posts, American farmers carving homesteads from dense forest. Neither side knew how long the peace would hold. Eventually, a treaty was signed, meant to settle it all. The Oregon Treaty of 1846 drew a clean, elegant line. The 49th parallel would separate British and American territory to the middle of the channel which separates the continent from Vancouver Island, and then south through the Strait of Juan de Fuca into the Pacific. But the line was not as simple as it seemed. The treaty mentioned a channel, but it never said which one. Between the mainland and Vancouver Island lay not a single channel, but two, the Haro Strait to the west and the Rosario Strait to the east. And in between them sat a scatter of forested isles, dozens of them, including the largest and most coveted, San Juan Island. If the boundary followed the Haro Strait, San Juan would fall to the Americans. If it followed the Rosario, the British would retain it. Neither side could agree. Neither side was willing to let go. And so began a strange period of shared tension. British subjects, led by the Hudson's Bay Company, set up sheep farms on San Juan Island. They grazed hundreds of animals on the open grasslands and built a small outpost near the coast. Their presence was steady, orderly, legal in their own eyes. Meanwhile, American settlers, emboldened by the idea that this was American land by virtue of geography and divine fate, began arriving as well. They built cabins, planted gardens, claimed parcels under American territorial law. Many believed they had every right to be there and resented the British as intruders. The island itself had no defenses, no forts, no customs house, no unified authority. Instead, it became a theater of overlapping assumptions. Every act, every fence built, every sheep slaughtered, every tree cut, carried more weight than it seemed to. These were gestures in a slow-motion chess game played across fog and forest. And yet, For a time it held. There were arguments, yes, disputes over land and livestock, but no blood. The island became a quiet echo of the broader tensions between two distant governments. The settlers, British and American alike, lived side by side with wariness, but without violence. That is, until the pig. The pig was in some ways just a symptom. But in history, symptoms can become symbols, and symbols can become catalysts. By the time Lyman Cutler fired his rifle into the potato patch, the border dispute had already festered for over a decade. His shot did not create the crisis. It revealed it. News of the incident spread quickly, carried by word of mouth and courier boat. On both sides of the water, settlers braced for what might come next. On the mainland, American officials debated their response. And in Victoria, the British colonial capital, the death of the pig was treated as an affront to imperial authority. The ambiguity of the border had always been a powder keg. Now, with smoke curling from a farmer's rifle, the fuse had been lit. In Washington Territory, Brigadier General William Harney took immediate interest. Harney was no diplomat. He was a veteran of multiple wars, headstrong and suspicious of British motives. To him, the killing of the pig was not the issue. It was the attempted arrest of an American by British authorities on what he considered U.S. soil. Harney's decision would define the weeks to come. Without consulting Washington, without seeking clearance from the State Department, he dispatched a small military force to San Juan Island. Their orders were clear: prevent any further British encroachment. Assert American control. Show strength. He chose Captain George Pickett to lead the detachment. Pickett, a man whose name would one day be etched in Civil War tragedy, was then a promising officer with a flair for drama and a deep sense of honor. He took his orders seriously. When he arrived on San Juan Island in July 1859 with 66 men, he raised the American flag high above the southern end of the island and issued a public statement. "We will make a Bunker Hill of it," he declared, "though it be our graves." It was an escalation that could not be ignored. Across the water, the Royal Navy mobilized. 3 British warships were dispatched to San Juan, their decks lined with cannon, their orders to assert sovereignty, but to avoid bloodshed if possible. Still, the sight of gunmetal against the green horizon sent a clear message. Now there were soldiers digging trenches, cannons being rolled into position, ships with gun ports open, their crews on alert. The island, once a misty buffer between nations, had become a point of confrontation. And yet, through it all, neither side fired a shot. It was a standoff governed not by treaties, but by nerves, pride, and the ghosts of poorly written lines on poorly drawn maps. And it all rested on a question no one could quite answer. To whom did the island belong? He had no name, no banner, no markings, no paper proving origin or worth. The pig, whose death nearly triggered war, was just that, a pig. Large, black, likely a Berkshire or Berkshire cross, intelligent by the standards of livestock, stubborn by reputation, and prone to wandering where he pleased. He belonged, loosely, to Charles Griffin, the manager of the Hudson's Bay Company's Bellevue sheep farm on the southern tip of San Juan Island. Or so Griffin believed. The pig, it seemed, had other ideas. Each morning, he roamed freely across the landscape, rooting in the underbrush, crossing invisible property lines, and delighting in the starchy gifts buried in Lyman Cutler's modest garden. There were few fences on San Juan Island in 1859, just trails, clearing lines, and assumptions. And in that quiet, unsupervised land, the pig grew accustomed to his morning routine. To Griffin, the pig was part of the company's assets, one of several pigs kept loosely near the sheep station to help feed the staff. But to Cutler, the animal was an uninvited menace. Time and again, he found his potatoes ruined, his rows disturbed. And time and again, he warned his British neighbors, "Keep your pig at home." But no one listened. Cutler had come to San Juan Island only recently. Like many American settlers, he was drawn by the promise of free land under the Donation Land Claim Act. He had cleared a patch of trees, built a crude cabin, and coaxed crops from shallow, unforgiving soil. Every potato mattered. Every row represented survival. In his eyes, the pig's destruction was more than annoyance. It was a threat to his livelihood. On that overcast morning in June, the pig returned once more to Cutler's garden. He nosed through the dirt, turning soil with a practiced snout, unaware or uncaring of the boundary he had crossed. This time, Cutler reached for his rifle. He did not shout. He did not warn. He simply took aim and fired. The pig fell instantly, blood staining the earth it had disturbed. In that moment, no one could have imagined the consequences. Cutler, by all accounts, was not looking for trouble. His reaction, while severe, was not unusual by frontier standards. Farmers often dispatched animals, even their neighbors, when they damaged crops, especially when warnings had gone ignored. What set this case apart was not the act, but the ownership. Charles Griffin saw the death as a personal affront. The pig, in his view, was private property, British property, and its killing by an American settler was nothing less than a violation of British rights on British soil. Griffin demanded compensation. When Cutler offered $10, Griffin balked. He wanted $100, a sum he knew the American would never pay. Behind his demand was more than money. It was assertion, authority, proof that British law still held weight on San Juan Island. Cutler refused. He countered that the pig had trespassed, that he had a right to defend his crops, and that he owed no apology. Behind his defiance was not just frustration, but national identity. He was an American. This was American land, and he would not be judged by a British subject. The standoff deepened. Griffin escalated the matter to British authorities at Fort Victoria, calling for Cutler's arrest. Word spread among the American settlers, who rallied behind Cutler and sent an urgent plea to U.S. military officials. British forces were threatening an American citizen. Help must come. The pig's death had become political. At the heart of this absurd standoff was a legal void. The Oregon Treaty had drawn a vague line. No one knew precisely where British jurisdiction ended and American authority began. Each side assumed the island belonged to them, and in that shared uncertainty, every dispute, even over a pig, became amplified. In Victoria, Governor James Douglas viewed the incident with rising concern. He had long feared American encroachment in the region. The influx of settlers, the growing presence of American symbols, it all pointed to a slow erosion of British control. The pig's death, to him, was just the latest signal that the Americans were testing the limits. But Douglas was a cautious man. He did not want war, especially over livestock. He hoped the matter could be settled locally, with fines or civil action. Still, he allowed the possibility of arrest, not of Cutler himself, but as a warning. Meanwhile, in the American camp, the incident confirmed what many had feared. To them, the British were encroaching, threatening their rights, and undermining the treaty. The pig was a footnote. The issue was sovereignty. When General Harney heard of the incident, he saw it not as an isolated misunderstanding, but as a pattern of British aggression. And Harney, with his military instincts and personal dislike of the British, believed the time had come to draw a line, literally and figuratively. He sent troops, but even then, with soldiers deploying and ships mobilizing, no one could quite answer a basic question: who actually owned the pig? There were no official records, no branding, no proof. Griffin claimed ownership, but others whispered the pig had often wandered between farms, that he'd been fed by American settlers, sometimes slept near Cutler's cabin, and roamed freely. He was, they said, a creature of the island more than any man. In the weeks that followed, as soldiers marched and naval cannons lined the coast, the pig became something stranger than livestock. He became a symbol, absurd and profound, of everything unresolved between nations. A creature whose death exposed the soft underbelly of empire, and in the background, the island itself remained quiet. The fog returned each morning, clinging to the trees. Rain fell in fine mist. Birds called across empty fields. The soil where the pig had died grew still again, the blood long dried. But overhead, tension thickened. 2 flags, 2 sets of laws, 2 definitions of justice, all colliding over one life, now gone. What might have been resolved with a handshake now demanded diplomacy. The pig had no master in the end, not Griffin, not Cutler, not even the empires they represented. His death marked the borderless absurdity of the age, the thin line between absurdity and catastrophe. And soon, that line would be drawn not by settlers or soldiers, but by men in great coats, with ink and worry in their hands. But before that could happen, the standoff had to grow colder. The island had to be tested, and the shadow of the pig, that nameless creature with mud on its snout and no allegiance to crown or constitution, would continue to haunt every decision made in the months ahead. The wind on San Juan Island carried no allegiance. It drifted between cabins and grazing hills, brushing the tents of American soldiers and the decks of British ships, whispering through cedar boughs with an indifference that mocked the men standing guard. It stirred 2 flags over the same soil, one stitched with stars, the other with a cross of red. And as they fluttered, tension settled like mist. By late July 1859, the island had become a paradox. On its southern tip, Captain George Pickett stood firm with his detachment of U.S. infantry. They had pitched tents, dug shallow earthworks, and mounted rifles where once there had been only sheep and settlers. To them, the flag above their heads was a declaration: this land belonged to the United States. Out in the waters of Griffin Bay, 3 British warships floated at anchor. Their hulls were dark with tar, their sails furled. Each bore the white ensign of the Royal Navy. Cannons lined their flanks. Officers walked the decks with spyglasses, keeping watch over the American camp. The message was equally clear. This was British territory. And between them stood an island trying to pretend it was still quiet. The settlers, perhaps 50 or 60 in total, were caught in the strange stillness of the standoff. They gathered their eggs, mended fences, and harvested their meager crops under the silent gaze of foreign powers. Children played in view of soldiers. Mothers carried water past stacked rifles. No one had fired a shot, but no one felt safe. Captain Pickett, proud and theatrical, took his post seriously. In his written dispatches, he spoke of honor, duty, and defending American citizens against foreign threat. He believed that if he showed resolve, the British would retreat, or at the very least, respect the American claim. But British authorities saw Pickett's actions differently. Governor James Douglas, from his headquarters in Victoria, was outraged. He had allowed the local constable to investigate the pig incident, not to provoke conflict, but to assert legal order. The sudden arrival of U.S. troops, however, was a dramatic escalation. It was, in his words, a flagrant insult to Her Majesty's sovereignty. Still, Douglas did not order an attack. Instead, he appealed to Rear Admiral Robert L. Baines, commander of the British Pacific Fleet. Baines, a seasoned officer with little taste for rash moves, arrived with his warships, but refused to allow his men to engage. "I will not involve two great nations in a war over a squabble about a pig," he said. And so the standoff held. Each side believed it had the moral high ground. The Americans claimed they were protecting their citizens. The British claimed they were defending their territory. Neither side wanted to be the first to retreat. Neither wanted to be blamed for starting a war. The result was a kind of tension that moved like smoke, visible but hard to grasp. Despite the military buildup, there were no formal battle lines, no clashes. Instead, what followed was a surreal period of cohabitation. British officers came ashore and dined with American commanders. Toasts were made, stories were shared, and then each returned to his own camp, knowing the cannons remained loaded. Pickett, always aware of appearances, maintained a strict military decorum. His men performed drills, kept watch, and displayed the flag each morning with solemn ceremony. They knew they were being observed, not just by British sailors, but by history itself. The British, for their part, remained measured. Their ships loomed over the bay like steel warnings, but their officers often spoke in terms of containment, not conquest. Douglas and Baines both feared that one miscalculation, one shot in the fog, could drag London and Washington into open conflict. The Americans sent reinforcements. Soon, over 400 troops were stationed on the island. They dug deeper trenches, built a more permanent camp, and waited. British ships were joined by others. The harbor, once calm and bare, now bristled with naval power. And all of it, the fortifications, the anchored warships, the tense communiques, stemmed from a treaty line never fully drawn, and the dead pig buried beneath a patch of potatoes. Back in Washington, news of the crisis traveled slowly, borne by ships and whispers. When word finally reached the capital, President James Buchanan was alarmed. He had enough troubles at home. The nation was already fracturing along sectional lines. The last thing he needed was a border war with the British. He sent a diplomat. General Winfield Scott, hero of the Mexican-American War and one of the few men respected by both the military and political class, was dispatched to the Pacific Northwest. His instructions were clear: defuse the crisis, avoid conflict, and find a way to calm the waters before they boiled over. Scott, towering and deliberate, arrived months later with gravity and patience. He spoke first with Harney, then Pickett, then with Douglas and Baines. He listened, nodded, and reminded each party of the stakes. Quietly, he proposed a compromise. Both sides would maintain a symbolic presence on the island, but in equal numbers. A joint military occupation, 50 men from each nation stationed at opposite ends of San Juan Island. No more, no less. They would remain until the border could be resolved diplomatically. To most, it seemed absurd. Soldiers camped side by side, representing two global powers on a speck of land disputed over livestock. But it worked. Pickett stepped down. The American camp shrank. British ships eased their patrols. And for the first time in weeks, the island exhaled. The flags still flew, but with less fury. The tension faded, if only slightly. The island became a symbol not of war, but of restraint. And so, through the long summer and into the coming years, San Juan Island settled into a peculiar rhythm. British redcoats stood guard at the northern end. American infantry kept watch to the south. They exchanged greetings, shared supplies, held joint celebrations on holidays. It was, perhaps, the most peaceful military occupation in modern memory. But the issue was far from resolved. The Oregon Treaty's ambiguity remained. The question of sovereignty hung like low fog, always there, never answered. And the pig, whose death had shaken governments, remained unmemorialized. There was no statue, no marker, no grave. Only a faded story, passed between soldiers and settlers, about the moment a single animal pulled two nations toward the edge. It would take a foreign hand to decide the final line. But for now, that decision rested in silence. And on the island, beneath the shadow of two flags, a fragile peace held. The most dangerous sound was silence. Not cannon fire, not musket shots, not the clatter of bayonets or the roar of charging horses. No. In the summer of 1859, the greatest threat to peace was the quiet pause between governments, when words ceased and assumptions filled the void. After Captain Pickett raised the American flag on San Juan Island and British warships answered with their quiet threat from the bay, a strange stillness settled into place. Washington and London, separated by months of communication delay, remained caught in the early stages of confusion. Letters had been sent, reports drafted, but no reply had yet arrived. And in that space between message and answer, men waited. On the island, the soldiers played their roles. American troops sharpened bayonets and drilled in formation. They mended tents. They patrolled in pairs. They watched the sea each morning as the fog lifted to reveal Her Majesty's warships lying still in the water like sleeping giants, half submerged, watching. The British ships did not fire. Their cannons were loaded but cold. Their officers kept logs, paced decks, and relayed messages by semaphore. They did not land. They did not leave. It was not war. But it wasn't peace. It was something stranger, a diplomatic no man's land where orders came late and fear came early, where the presence of calm was not a sign of safety, but of tension too swollen to move. Back in Victoria, Governor James Douglas grew restless. He had governed British Columbia through gold rushes, uprisings, and waves of American migrants. He had dealt with smugglers and threats, with native uprisings and trade crises. But this insult, as he saw it, this was different. A direct challenge to British authority by armed American soldiers on land he believed belonged to the Crown. He drafted reports, urgent and stern, and sent them across the sea. He begged London for instruction, for reinforcement, for recognition of the danger. And yet, in those early weeks, no reply came. The Atlantic was vast. Communications were slow. So Douglas acted in the meantime. He sent ships, but with orders not to fire unless attacked. He authorized a symbolic presence, but warned his officers to be cautious. He was playing with powder and trying not to light a match. On the American side, General Harney believed he had done the right thing. In his eyes, The British had overstepped by trying to arrest an American citizen on American land. The arrival of Pickett's troops was not aggression, it was defense, a show of resolve, a necessary assertion. But he too was operating in a void. Washington had not replied to his decision. No orders had come to reinforce or retreat. He sent his own letters, defending his actions, arguing that failure to respond would embolden British expansionism. He expected gratitude. What he received was a summons. When word of the San Juan crisis finally reached President James Buchanan in Washington, D.C., it arrived wrapped in confusion. Reports from the West were vague, alarming, and sometimes contradictory. There were rumors of British ships lining American shores, tales of imminent invasion, wild speculation, and very little clarity. Buchanan, aging and politically embattled, was in no mood for another conflict. The country teetered on the edge of civil war. Slavery debates raged in Congress. The Union strained. The idea of war with Britain, over livestock no less, seemed unthinkable. Yet the situation was real. British naval vessels were within sight of American troops. Both sides were armed. One mistake, one panicked reaction, and blood could spill. If it did, neither capital would be able to retreat gracefully. It would be a war, not over principle, but over pride. So Buchanan acted with rare clarity. He dispatched General Winfield Scott, the most seasoned soldier in America, famed for his dignity and diplomacy. Scott, who had led armies in Mexico and faced off against threats from Canada to Charleston, was the only man with the stature to calm both generals and politicians. He was also nearly 73 years old, plagued by illness, and weary from years of internal strife. But he accepted the mission. He set sail for the West Coast, a journey of weeks, bearing orders not to provoke, not to escalate, but to preserve peace at all cost. While Scott made his way westward, the island remained frozen. The joint occupation had not yet been formalized. Pickett remained in command, still writing dramatic dispatches and parading his troops. The British ships still waited in the bay, a daily reminder that the matter was far from over. On the ground, tensions softened in odd ways. Officers from both sides occasionally met, not as enemies, but as neighbors. They shared cigars, exchanged newspapers, sometimes even drank together in quiet corners of the island. It was a kind of truce, born not of treaties, but of human exhaustion. The settlers, too, adapted. Children grew used to the sight of redcoats. Farmers learned to carry on under watchful eyes. Some even began to treat the standoff as a fact of life, something permanent, like the weather or the tides. But beneath the civility was fear. All it would take was one gunshot, one accident, one soldier, half asleep on watch, misinterpreting movement in the mist. The world would change. And thousands of miles away, two governments struggled to find the words that might stop it. The silence between Washington and London had always been dangerous. Treaties were written quickly, often by men unfamiliar with the land they were dividing. Maps were old, descriptions vague. In 1846, when the Oregon Treaty declared that the boundary would run through the middle of the channel, no one in the room could have pointed to that channel with confidence. The Haro Strait, the Rosario Strait, both were channels. Both lay between Vancouver Island and the mainland, and both flanked San Juan Island, making it the orphaned child of diplomatic oversight. It was this silence, this failure to define, that allowed the crisis to bloom. By the time Scott arrived in the Pacific Northwest, Both the Americans and the British had hardened their stances, but they had not yet crossed the final line. His task was to keep it that way. Scott met first with General Harney, who bristled at any suggestion that he had acted improperly. Harney believed he had prevented British aggression. He defended Pickett's deployment, insisting that it was both legal and justified. But Scott, experienced in the dance of diplomacy, gently reminded him, sometimes restraint was the better defense. Then he crossed the waters to meet with Governor Douglas. Douglas, too, was firm, but tired. He had no desire to start a war over principle. He sought respect, not conflict, and in Scott, he found someone he could speak with. The two men, veterans of different worlds, found common ground in caution. What followed was the quietest negotiation of the century. No declarations, no ceremonies, just handshakes, nods, and a whispered agreement. Until the border could be settled, each side would maintain a peaceful presence. A small detachment of British Royal Marines at the north end of the island, and a matched force of American infantry at the south, 50 men apiece. No reinforcements, no provocations. The pig, in all this, was not mentioned, and so the agreement took hold. The British built modest quarters at what became known as English Camp, complete with a neat parade ground and tended gardens. The Americans established American Camp, their flag flying over a bluff with views of the sea. Between them lay miles of open land, unoccupied except by wind and wildlife. Soldiers passed the time with drills, card games, letters, and watch rotations. On occasion, they crossed paths. Sometimes they traded. Sometimes they argued, but never again did they raise arms. And in the background, the governments continued to negotiate. But negotiation, like erosion, is a slow force. Years passed. The Civil War engulfed America. Queen Victoria aged. Treaties shifted. Empires rose and began to look inward. But San Juan remained unchanged, a place where two flags flew and said nothing, where men guarded invisible lines, where silence had become the language of peace. He stood alone, and he would not back down. Captain George Pickett, tall and theatrical, with a mane of dark hair and a voice made for proclamations, believed in honor more than compromise. In the calm fog of San Juan Island, surrounded by uncertainty and facing the might of the British Empire, he saw not ambiguity, but a test of resolve. And he resolved to hold the line. When word came that a British official had attempted to arrest an American settler over the shooting of a pig, Pickett didn't hesitate. He considered it not a legal matter, not a misunderstanding between neighbors, but an assault on the dignity of the United States. This island, he believed, was American soil. To give an inch would be to yield everything. And George Pickett, son of Virginia and soldier of ambition, had no intention of yielding anything. Pickett arrived on San Juan in July of 1859 with a small detachment of 66 men from the 9th Infantry Regiment. They disembarked with gear, muskets, and an American flag. He ordered tents pitched on the southern bluff, a defensible spot with wide views of the sea. There, in sight of British ships anchored in Griffin Bay, he raised the stars and stripes. His declaration was clear. He issued a public statement to the island settlers, many of whom were nervous, uncertain, or simply exhausted by the drama unfolding in their backyards. By authority of the United States government, he announced, I have taken possession of this island in the name of my country. I shall not permit any armed force to exercise authority over American citizens here. His words echoed with theatrical grandeur, but behind the bravado was something genuine, conviction. To Pickett, the British were intruders. The Oregon Treaty, though vague, had given the San Juan Islands to the United States, at least in his interpretation. He believed that failure to assert dominance now would embolden British expansionists, that this was not just about land or livestock, but legacy. News of Pickett's actions spread fast, not just to Victoria, where Governor Douglas was already furious, but across the water to American settlers who now found themselves living under a soldier's gaze. Some were reassured, others were alarmed. British warships appeared within days. 3 vessels, Tribune, Satellite, and Plumper, anchored just offshore, their black hulls bristling with cannon. Royal Marines stood at attention on deck. Officers watched through telescopes. To the settlers on shore, the presence was unmistakable. Tension curled in the fog like smoke. Still, Pickett stood firm. He rejected all British attempts at negotiation, including an officer who came ashore under a flag of truce to inquire whether Pickett might consider stepping back, not surrendering, simply pausing, allowing cooler heads to prevail, preventing escalation. But Pickett refused. He believed retreat would signal weakness, that diplomacy would dilute American rights, that he, standing on that bluff with 60-odd men and a stubborn heart, was the thin line between his country's honor and its humiliation. He wrote to General Harney, "I shall make a Bunker Hill of it, sir, though it be my grave." It was more than a metaphor. Bunker Hill was one of the bloodiest early battles of the American Revolution, a conflict that, like this one, had begun with confusion, pride, and a failure to compromise. Across the bay, Rear Admiral Robert Baines of the British Royal Navy received his own orders from Governor Douglas: land troops, if necessary, to preserve British sovereignty. But Baines hesitated. He saw in Pickett not an aggressor, but a man caught in a larger web, a young officer making decisions that might spark a war between empires. Baines, seasoned and steady, knew what such a war would look like. He had fought before. He had seen blood on decks, limbs shattered by cannon fire, the cost of pride dressed up as patriotism. And he would not start a war over a pig. "I will not involve 2 great nations in a war over a squabble about a pig," he reportedly told his officers. So the warships held position. The cannons stayed quiet. Pickett, aware of the restraint but unwilling to trust it, continued to fortify his camp. He positioned sentries at all hours. He drilled his men daily. He watched the ships with suspicion, even as their officers in private admitted they hoped never to fire a single shot. Then came General Harney's reinforcements. When Pickett's reports reached Harney on the mainland, the general, never one to shrink from confrontation, approved more troops. Soon, nearly 450 U.S. soldiers occupied the southern end of San Juan Island. Tents multiplied, wagons rumbled ashore, horses snorted in the grass. The camp grew, no longer a symbolic gesture, but a visible statement. The Americans had come to stay. The British responded in kind. Admiral Baines increased his naval presence, and more Royal Marines were dispatched to reinforce Victoria. While none landed on San Juan itself, their proximity made intentions clear. And through it all, Pickett remained unchanged. He issued statements. He wrote letters. He hosted fellow officers with wine and speech-making. He stood, a solitary figure of defiance, while the island held its breath. Not everyone supported him. Some American settlers found his presence unnerving, not because they were unpatriotic, but because they understood the fragile nature of frontier life. They had no appetite for war, They wanted peace, farms, families, not soldiers and warships. Others admired his resolve. They saw him as a bulwark against British dominance, a man unafraid to claim what was rightfully American. Even within the military, opinions varied. When General Winfield Scott arrived months later and surveyed the situation, he found Pickett's stance brave, but reckless. The island did not require heroes, he thought. It required negotiators. Scott's arrival marked a turning point. Pickett, relieved of command, returned to the mainland. He had not retreated. He had not surrendered, but his role was over. He would later go on to infamy during the Civil War, leading the disastrous charge at Gettysburg that now bears his name. But long before that, before the uniforms turned gray and the Union began to fracture, George Pickett had stood on a fog-wrapped island in the Pacific and dared the British Empire to cross him. They didn't. And so, in a strange twist of restraint, the general who refused to retreat helped prevent a war by standing firm long enough for wiser heads to arrive. After Pickett's departure, the atmosphere on San Juan shifted. The drama remained, but the temperature cooled. The flags still flew. The guns remained nearby. But now, diplomacy was in charge. American and British forces agreed to a joint occupation, 50 men on each side, no more, no less, separate camps, separate routines, a shared silence. And yet, the memory of Pickett lingered. His name had become legend on the island. To some, a warning. To others, a badge of courage. But history would remember him for what did not happen. No war, no shots, no graves. Just a man who stood on principle, on soil he believed was his country's, and waited, rigid and defiant, until the world caught up. The sea, in time, forgets the ships that sailed it. Long after their sails have lowered, after their cannons have rusted and their names faded from ledgers, the water rolls on, indifferent, unmarked. But for a moment in 1859, the sea around San Juan Island held its breath beneath the shadow of war. The British warships arrived slowly, without fanfare, without music. No ceremonial salutes, no blaring signals, just the soft groan of hulls, the creak of rigging, and the cold gleam of cannons turned toward a forested shore. 3 ships anchored just offshore, HMS Tribune, HMS Satellite, and HMS Plumper, their names now barely known, but then they loomed like warnings. To the American settlers who lived along the island's southern edge, the arrival of these vessels was not just a military gesture. It was a message. You are not alone here. This land is not yet settled. Every root you plant is shadowed by a flag that may not be yours. To Captain George Pickett, the warships were a test, and to the British, they were insurance. Rear Admiral Robert Baines had received his orders from Governor James Douglas with formality and caution: protect British interests, enforce law, avoid war unless absolutely necessary. And so, the ships were sent not to fire, but to watch, to loom, to remind. From aboard their decks, sailors watched the American camp through spyglasses. They sketched its layout in notebooks. They counted tents, tracked sentries, estimated firepower, but their guns stayed cold. The standoff had begun. The Royal Navy by then was a sprawling arm of empire. Its ships patrolled every ocean, its officers trained for discipline and discretion. But San Juan Island presented a rare challenge. It was not a battlefield, but a disputed comma in a treaty. And the enemy, if there was one, wore no uniform of aggression. Pickett's men dug no trenches. They raised no fort. But they stood their ground. In response, the British did not land troops, but their presence hung like thunderclouds over the bay. Their silhouettes became part of the island's horizon, dark shapes against dawn and dusk. Children pointed. Farmers measured them with anxious glances. At night, their lanterns flickered faintly across the water like stars trapped beneath the surface. The warships had orders: defend the Empire's claim to the island, but only if provoked. It was a strategy of visible patience, a chess move not made, but implied. Admiral Baines understood the stakes. He had seen combat. He had commanded fleets across the globe. But now, he stared across a narrow channel at an American flag and a captain who would not yield. He knew that one misfire, one shot, accidental or not, would ignite a blaze far larger than San Juan Island. So he waited, and behind him, the Crown waited too. London had not yet decided how to interpret the situation. The reports from Victoria were urgent, but the distance was great. Each dispatch took weeks to cross the Atlantic and weeks more for a reply to return. In that delay, a kind of bureaucratic fog gathered, like the mist that clung each morning to the pine-covered hills of the island. In the absence of clear orders, it fell to Baines to judge. Each morning, his men polished the guns. They drilled. They trained. But they did not fire. Even when American troops expanded their encampment, when fresh soldiers landed and Pickett's presence swelled to 400 men, Baines kept the cannons quiet. He later wrote to his superiors, "I will not allow two nations to go to war over the squabble of a pig." It was a sentence that history would remember, not for its humor, though it was strange and true, but for its wisdom. It was not restraint born of weakness, but of clarity, a refusal to let pride dictate policy. Pickett might have been ready to fight, but Baines refused to become the man who pulled the trigger. On the island itself, the effects were surreal. Imagine a patch of forested land, barely 40 miles long, housing two military forces who did not speak, yet did not fight. Every morning, two flags were raised. Bugles sounded on opposite ends of the island. Watch rotations were kept, muskets cleaned. And yet, the enemy never advanced. Some days, soldiers crossed paths while gathering water or hunting game. They eyed one another from a distance. They nodded. Occasionally, a smile. Rarely a word. There were no battles, no bloodshed. But there were nerves. The Americans knew that the British ships held superior firepower. The British knew that any act of aggression might ignite a broader war. Each side waited for orders that never came, frozen in a posture of controlled tension. Even the settlers began to adjust. They built their routines around the rhythm of the standoff. Children learned not to wander too far. Farmers avoided planting too close to either camp. A strange civility took hold, the kind that arises not from trust, but from shared vulnerability. As weeks turned to months, the warships remained. They became part of the landscape, distant but imposing. Their anchors clinked softly beneath the waves. Their smoke curled faintly from the galley chimneys. At night, their lanterns were the only light on the water. Their crews grew restless. Some sailors carved scrimshaw. Others kept journals filled with frustration and longing. Many wondered aloud why they had been stationed here, watching an island where nothing ever happened. But that was the point. Nothing happened. And that was the victory. Because in an age when empire often meant conquest, when misunderstandings could cascade into war, the decision not to fire was the most radical act of all. General Winfield Scott arrived in the Pacific Northwest in October 1859. By then, the standoff had stabilized. There had been no violence, no further incidents, just long days beneath two flags and a horizon filled with masts and caution. Scott, deliberate, met with Pickett, then with Baines, and then with Governor Douglas. He listened. He observed. He did not accuse, or condemn, or boast. Instead, he proposed something few had dared imagine: a peaceful joint occupation. 50 American soldiers, 50 British Royal Marines, each with their own camp. Equal presence, no expansion, no weapons beyond what was needed for basic defense. Baines agreed. So did Douglas. And so did Washington. And the warships, those quiet giants of diplomacy, turned and left. They had not fired a shot, but they had done their job. When HMS Tribune and her sisters raised anchor and faded into the northern mist, they left behind no monuments, no graves, no wounds, only the story that for a brief moment history had paused on a single decision: to fight or not to defend honor, or to protect peace. The Royal Navy had come prepared for war, but it had left having preserved something rarer: silence. And that silence, over time, became the legacy of San Juan Island. Not a battlefield, not a war, but a place where two nations stood face to face and chose deliberately not to cross the line. It was a war with no gunfire, no casualties, no burning fields or broken cities, no charges, no retreats, no cries for vengeance. Just two camps, 50 men each, quietly standing on a mist-veiled island, separated by trees, sea wind, and an unresolved treaty line. No declarations were ever made. No victory was ever claimed. But for 12 long years, the United States and Great Britain technically remained at war on San Juan Island. This is how that war was lived. On the southern tip of the island stood the American camp, a modest outpost of white tents and rough-hewn cabins, flying the stars and stripes over a bluff that overlooked the sea. Here, soldiers of the 9th Infantry drilled in the mornings, tended their vegetable gardens in the afternoon, and read weathered newspapers by lantern light as dusk settled. On the northern end, nestled between Douglas firs and wild rose thickets, stood the British Royal Marines. Their camp was neater, more ornamental, with gravel paths, rose beds, and a formally laid-out parade ground. The Union Jack flapped gently above a row of red-coated tents. Between them stretched miles of unguarded terrain. There were no fences, no patrols, no border posts, only invisible lines, drawn not on maps, but in memory. Lines that both sides agreed, silently, not to cross. And in this strange silence, a rhythm formed. The daily life of a soldier in the Pig War was not one of strategy or battle drills. It was one of farming, fishing, and waiting. American troops planted potatoes, built ovens from brick and stone, raised chickens, and experimented with corn and beans in the rocky soil. They hunted deer in the woods and sometimes caught trout in the streams. The British did the same. Their cookhouses were more refined and their uniforms more polished, but the tasks were much the same. Gather wood, preserve meat, keep the camp clean. Even discipline, when it faltered, was answered with gardening duties or kitchen shifts, rather than the lash. Letters from this period speak not of war, but of boredom. Some soldiers described San Juan Island as the loneliest post they'd ever served. Others wrote of its strange beauty, the moss-draped trees, the long rains, the sea air scented with salt and pine. And though these men came prepared to defend their nation's honor, many found themselves defending their vegetable plots from raccoons and their boots from the endless mud. There was, between the two camps, a cautious familiarity. British and American officers would occasionally dine together on neutral ground. Formal invitations were sometimes exchanged for holiday events. Christmas feasts, 4th of July fireworks, Queen Victoria's birthday. They traded tobacco, whiskey, and newspapers. They shared rumors and letters. Some even played cricket or baseball with uniforms neatly pressed, muskets left in tents, and the war, such as it was, suspended for an afternoon. There are stories, preserved in journals and diaries, of soldiers growing friendly, even fond, of their counterparts. One American wrote of a British Marine named Thomas, with whom he shared coffee and sea stories every other Sunday. "He taught me to mend boots," the letter reads, "and I taught him how to dice potatoes with speed." Yet, for all this warmth, the flags still flew. Each camp remained vigilant. Arms were kept at the ready, guards posted at dusk. They might be friendly, but they were not friends. Not yet. Each man served under the quiet tension of two nations who had chosen not to fight, but had not yet chosen to forgive. The civilians of the island, still few in number, learned to live within this divided world. They knew to be careful with their words, to nod politely to both camps, to carry their disputes not to soldiers, but to their own village councils. For them, the standoff brought not danger, but a strange sense of safety. Where once they'd feared pirates, raiders, and wild animals, now there were two small armies standing guard, neither threatening them, and both eager to maintain order. Children grew up watching the drills of both armies. Some could mimic both bugle calls. Some learned to say "sir" with an American accent and a British one. And in the forests between the camps, wild deer wandered unbothered. Crows nested in the flagpoles. The island grew more tangled, more human, more strange, caught between two empires and a pig-shaped memory. Back in the capitals, Washington and London, the urgency of the crisis had long faded. Other matters consumed them. The American Civil War erupted just 2 years after the initial standoff. General Pickett, once the fiery face of American resolve on San Juan, would ride into history and infamy at the head of a doomed Confederate charge in Gettysburg. In Britain, the empire expanded, faltered, and expanded again. New colonies were claimed, new railroads laid. The matter of San Juan faded into the background, a footnote in an old treaty. And yet, the camps remained. No one wanted to be the first to leave. To withdraw would be to concede. And so, the quietest war in history continued, not out of necessity, but inertia, year after year, parade after parade, flag after flag, and the island waited. It would be more than a decade before the final chapter began. In 1871, a new treaty was signed between the United States and Great Britain, the Treaty of Washington, designed to settle a variety of disputes between the two countries. One clause in that treaty addressed the San Juan question. The decision, both sides agreed, would be handed to a neutral arbitrator. They chose Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany. And so, the fate of San Juan Island, the legacy of the dead pig, the standoff, the dual camps, would be placed in the hands of a European monarch, thousands of miles away, who had never set foot on the island's soil. He convened a tribunal. He heard arguments. He studied maps. He read every clause of the 1846 Oregon Treaty and considered every testimony, sketch, and sailor's account. And then, in October 1872, he made his decision. The island would belong to the United States. The British, true to their word, accepted the ruling with grace. And in November of that year, the Royal Marines at English Camp lowered the Union Jack for the final time. They stood in formation. They saluted. The flag was folded and carried away. A bugle sounded. Boots crunched in gravel. And then they boarded ships and sailed home. The Americans did not cheer. There were no celebrations, only the quiet shifting of roles. The war, if it could be called that, was over. The island was whole. And the pig, long dead, long buried, had found its place in history. Some places are made for war. They bear scars, stone walls torn by cannon, fields furrowed by boots and blood. They hold echoes of screams, the ghostly weight of grief. But San Juan Island was never meant to bleed. Through a quirk of map-making and a forgotten clause in a treaty, this forested dot in the Pacific became the stage for one of history's most unusual conflicts. But what lingered most? Long after the soldiers folded their tents and the warships vanished into the mist, was how thoroughly it refused to become a battlefield. In a century defined by gunpowder and empire, the island stood as an outlier, not because of what happened there, but because of what didn't. After the Royal Marines lowered their flag in November of 1872 and departed from English Camp, San Juan Island returned to silence. Not the tense silence of a standoff, but the softer quiet of something resolved. The American detachment, left alone now, remained for a time. Their presence was symbolic, a flag on a hill, a reminder of a question once asked and finally answered. But even they would soon thin in numbers, their drills less frequent, their bugle calls softer. The settlers resumed their lives without watchers in red or blue. The potato fields returned. Children roamed freely between former camps. The trails that once separated British from American now became simple footpaths between neighbors. And the island, unbloodied and whole, seemed to sigh with relief. In the years following the arbitration, memories of the conflict faded fast. No monuments were raised, no generals toured the site, no textbooks gave more than a few words to the pig war. Even the name itself, quaint, strange, ensured it would be remembered more for its absurdity than its consequence. But for those who had lived it, the memory was quieter, more personal. In private letters, soldiers wrote of the friendships forged in silence, of berry picking in no man's land, of stolen conversations across neutral streams. They spoke of a war where the enemy brought tea instead of gunfire, and where the outcome was not death, but dinner invitations. One British Marine, writing decades later from Yorkshire, recalled, "There was an American boy, Elijah, I think, who'd come to our fence each week with trout. We'd give him apples, and he'd tell us island stories. I never learned whose side he was on. Perhaps he didn't know either. The island had blurred the lines, softened the uniforms." American camp and English camp, once symbols of looming conflict, became ruins. For years, their structures were left to rot, planks warped by rain, chimneys crumbling, parade grounds overtaken by grass. The forest crept in, indifferent to flags or diplomacy. Trees returned where tents once stood. Moss claimed the paths. But even decay told a story. Unlike so many forts of the era, there were no walls riddled with bullet holes, no graves bearing dates of sudden violence, no plaques to honor fallen sons, just earth gently folding over history. Visitors would sometimes stumble upon the remains, a stone foundation, a rusted hinge, a fence post leaning into fog. And they would ask, was there really a war here? The answer always was yes, but not the kind they expected. It was not until the 20th century that preservation efforts began. In the 1930s, local historians and federal agencies recognized the uniqueness of the pig war, the fact that in a time of expansion and violence, diplomacy had prevailed. Slowly, the remnants of both camps were restored. By 1966, San Juan Island National Historical Park was established, an oddity in the National Register, not for its battles, but for the bloodless war it commemorated. Paths were cleared, historical signs were placed, American camp was reconstructed in part, English camp's gardens were recultivated, the flagpole restored. And each year, on a quiet day in summer, reenactors now gather, not to refight, but to remember. There are no muskets fired, no sabers drawn, only readings, silent marches, and a shared picnic, sometimes between Canadians and Americans, beneath the same trees once shaded by soldiers who had waited for orders that never came. What San Juan Island preserved, more than structures or dates, was a model, a reminder that diplomacy, even when strained and clumsy, can prevail. That when men are given the time and space to speak rather than strike, the outcome may be not conquest, but cohabitation. It is a story of restraint, of a general who refused to retreat, and an admiral who refused to fire, of governments that stepped back from pride, and of soldiers who followed orders not to escalate, but to endure. In a world that often glorifies the dramatic, heroic deaths, decisive battles, bold charges into smoke and steel, San Juan Island stands quietly in contrast. There were no martyrs here, no last stands, no burning flags. There was, instead, a pig, a dead one, shot by a man defending his potatoes. And from that death grew not a war, but a question, a legal ambiguity, a challenge of maps and meaning. And from that question came soldiers, ships, speeches, and silence. But never blood, never smoke, never the scream of charge. Just mist, just morning drills, just two flags waiting. In the 21st century, the pig war still baffles schoolchildren and draws wry headlines from journalists. It is often remembered as a curiosity, a tale too odd to be real. But beneath the strangeness is something rare. Proof that war can be avoided, that pride can be restrained, that men, armed and anxious, can still choose not to kill, and that sometimes the most powerful chapter in a nation's story is the one without gunfire. It begins with a pig, not a king, not a revolution, not a secret plot or a midnight betrayal. Just a pig, black and bristled, nosing through a garden of foreign potatoes. And yet, from that one small moment of stubborn hunger, a ripple spread outward across empires. The year was 1859. The world was full of tension and boundary lines, and on San Juan Island, caught between British Columbia and the American frontier, a single gunshot became a question. What is a border? Where is the line? And when two nations claim the same quiet shore, which flag should rise? In the morning fog, the island still remembers. The wind still bends the grass where American tents once stood. The crows still circle the high pines where British Marines once marched. And somewhere, perhaps, beneath the moss and the cedar loam, the bones of that pig still rest, forgotten by time, remembered by history. No one marked its grave. but its name is spoken still, each time someone whispers, "The Pig War." A war that never burned a field, never filled a trench, never buried a son. A war measured in patience, not powder. And for 12 years, through every shifting season, 2 flags waved from 2 camps, facing one another in silence, waiting for words, not weapons. It is easy to forget such stories. They lack the drama of conquest. There are no statues to build, no medals to award. But what unfolded on San Juan Island was not emptiness. It was intention. It was the discipline of stillness, the courage of waiting, the art of stepping back when every instinct says, "Step forward." Pickett stood tall with his saber and his speech. Baines stood still with his warships and his silence. Scott arrived not to conquer, but to listen. And the Kaiser ruled with a pen, not a sword. None of them are remembered with the grandeur of battlefield glory. But in the quiet, in the restraint, they protected something greater, the possibility of peace. Today, the island is whole. There are trails where the parade grounds once rang with boots. There are gardens where rifles once rested. And there are names carved into plaques that no longer speak of war, but of waiting. Visitors walk between American camp and English camp in less than an hour. They see the 2 flags, one that stayed, one that was lowered. They read the signs. They ask the questions. How did this happen? How did a pig nearly cause a war? And how did 2 empires stop just short of letting it? The fog comes in low some mornings, soft and silver, draping over the old chimneys and trees. It is the same fog that once cloaked the redcoats as they loaded their muskets. The same fog that curled around Pickett's boots as he scanned the sea for British sails. The same fog that held the tension day after day, year after year. And even now, as it drapes across the fields, it seems to carry the hush of that long, uncertain waiting. 2 nations stood on the edge of war, and then didn't. So tonight, if you are drifting into sleep and your mind wanders gently through strange histories, let it rest a moment here, on that green island wrapped in mist. Let it linger with the soldiers who sharpened their bayonets and then packed them away, with the generals who argued and then agreed, with the pig who ate the wrong potatoes, and with the silence that saved thousands of lives. For not all wars are marked by thunder. Some thankfully end in quiet.